word study this morning that we want to look at is the word transgression. Now, transgression comes from a root concept of going or stepping with a preposition that's added to it that expresses parallel or alongside, to step alongside. It thereby indicates a stepping alongside regarding law, typically. It is primarily a legal term that denotes a person who violates the law through their actions, whether intentional or not. Therefore, a transgression is a sin that relates to the breaking of the law. That is the predominant use of your word transgression. A transgression is not restricted to use to only the Mosaic Law. The scribes and the Pharisees questioned Jesus concerning his disciples. They asked him why he permits them to transgress the traditions of the elders by not washing their hands before eating. See this over in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 2. They became zealous for the traditions of their fathers, considering actually the failure to ceremonially wash their hands before eating a violation of the law, a transgression. But that was a tradition of the fathers. That was never instructed under the Mosaic Law. So they kind of put that up above the law. In response, Jesus inquires why they violate God's commandment because of their traditions, Matthew chapter 15, verse 3. What the scribes would do, the scribes and the Pharisees would do, is they would take all of their possessions and they would declare that they have dedicated them unto God, and therefore use that as an excuse not to take care of their parents. Well, I can't give you anything that I have because I've dedicated it unto God. We see that over in Matthew chapter 14, verses 5 through 6. Thereby rejecting God's commandments. But they were very adamant about keeping the traditions of their fathers. Death reigned even though there was no law upon those who did not transgress as Adam did. And we see this over in Romans chapter 5 and verse 14. Adam broke the law when he ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. His sin brought death. Because remember, a transgression is sin. As God, of course, stated it would. Over in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 17, God stated, the day in which you eat it, dying, you will die. And our translations will say, surely you will die. But in the original, it's dying, you will die. Because what it is saying in the original is, by the act of eating, you guarantee your death. It actually doesn't indicate that he will drop dead immediately. It just guarantees that. And that, of course, is exactly what happened when he ate. Well, he then passed on this death to all men. Romans chapter 5 and verse 12 talks about that. Adam was not deceived. He knew the eating of the fruit of the tree would not make him wise. Eve was thoroughly deceived by Satan and fell into transgression. So even though Eve ate out of ignorance, in this case, because she was deceived, it's still a transgression, because the transgression of the law does not matter whether it's intentional or unintentional. You've still violated the law. And we see that over in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 14. Although Eve sinned, it was Adam's trespass and sin that brought spiritual and physical death to all. After Adam ate, they were both stripped of their garment of light. And you see this in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 7. This is because Adam determined in his mind to violate God's law, considering his own wisdom sufficient in the situation and thereby separating himself in his rationale from God, causing spiritual death. As remember, your concept of death is separation, it's not annihilation. So separating himself from God in his rationale, in his spirit. As the head of the creation, that is this creation of humans, this penalty was passed down to all his offsprings. Romans chapter 5 and verse 12, on the basis that all have sinned. Apart from law, there is no transgression. Romans chapter 4 and verse 15. Law works out wrath, whereas faith is according to grace. Therefore, the promise to Abraham is not only to those of the law, but also to those who are out from the faith of Abraham. Romans chapter 4 and verse 16 talks about that. In John's second letter, he uses the word transgression related to the doctrine of Christ. Now, in this case, he doesn't use it in a legal sense. So whoever transgresses and does not abide in the doctrine of the Christ does not have God. 2 John verse 9. John uses the word's root meaning to indicate someone who steps alongside the doctrine. Doctrine is the information that we learn and put into practice. The doctrine of the Christ relates to our position and equality in Christ. In Christ, there's no distinction between Jew and Gentile. We see that over in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 28. Yet, it was a big problem, especially at the beginning of the church, where Jews would come in and they would try to make that division and keep that division. Or the Jews would have, or the Gentiles would have to go under the Mosaic Law. But that's not that's not who we are in Christ. Therefore, those stepping alongside the doctrine will seek to separate groups, live by law, and usurp authority over other members of the body. The law was added on account of transgressions until the seed of the promise could come. This seed is the singular seed in the covenant given to Abraham in Genesis chapter 22 and verse 17. A singular seed that is Christ. We see that over in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16. The law was a governor and a child trainer until faith in Christ came. Galatians chapter 3 and verse 24. Therefore, the law is not against the promise of God. For if life could be given through the law, then righteousness would come through the works of the law. And we see that also in Galatians chapter 3, this time in verse 21. After faith in Christ came, there is no need for a child trainer. We do not need law, Galatians chapter 3 and verse 25, because faith in Christ has come. The law shows us how sinful our sin nature is. It does not give us the means to overcome our sin nature. Romans chapter 7 and verse 7.